All right, so welcome everyone. Thank you everybody for joining us on Zoom and in class. I'm going to give just a very, very brief introduction here. And then I'm gonna let Anthony Redgrave go ahead and take it away. So let me very briefly, because this is happening in a introduction to bioarchaeology class at UNH. And so my students have spent the last week thinking about, or now 2 weeks, right? Thinking about gender in the bioarchaeological record. So last week we talked about gender as performance and what that means and how we can see gender, if it would be appropriate to see gender in the archaeological record. And then this week we were talking about, all right, they had some readings on, transgender ideas and intersex ideas and skeletal records. So let me see, oh great. If I can forward advance this, yes. So I'm gonna let Anthony introduce himself, but really briefly, a few of you have met him before. Anthony Redgrave is our guest speaker. Thank you to Women in Gender Studies at UNH for sponsoring Anthony's talk today. He's the co-founder of the Trans Doe Task Force, along with his wife, Lee Bingham Redgrave. He's a co-founder of Redgrave Research, along with Lee as well. He's a forensic genealogist. He's pursuing his PhD, actually at University of New England, in educational design. And so he's Massachusetts based, so he's a great person for everyone to know about any of these topics. And he does all kinds of other fun stuff that I might beg him to talk about too. So this is what I would like my students to think about. It would be great if this showed up in your reflection papers for this week. And I don't want to take too much time away from Anthony, but I do want to give you kind of like an overall framing context, right? So we've talked about sex, we've talked about gender. Now let's really briefly introduce ourselves to the concept of biocolonialism. This topic comes up, especially in that Holloman article that I had you read for today. That's the book chapter in Exploring Sex and Gender. So biocolonialism is not an unfamiliar topic to you all that have taken classes with me, or any classes in anthropology, I hope, right? But it's this idea specifically to us, like let's talk about it just from a bioarch perspective, that as researchers, we always need to be cognizant that kind of this overemphasis on the truth, capital T, of the physical body or of someone's biology should never override or replace any beliefs about identity. Right? So this is kind of like the science versus like indigenous or community beliefs about the body. And I don't think it's any news to anyone here, right, that kind of science has a dark past in a lot of ways, and anthropology does too, right? So modern bioarchaeology then never would place science or data collection or anything like this over the beliefs, the practices, the cultural kind of attitudes of indigenous peoples, or it shouldn't. So we might be talking about ritual or religion, but let's also think about, we might be talking about gender and gender expression and gender performance. So this is what I would like you all in my class to think about. Those who are joining us from outside of things, if this is new to you, welcome. It's a really interesting concept to think about. And it's interesting to think about it as a bioarchaeologist because you kind of constantly have to be framing your work and your ideas against this, right? Yes, Rebecca, question.
So I know that since the beginning of archaeology and anthropology, this has improved and stuff, but I know right now online there's a huge surge of turf ideology and stuff. So is there kind of being a little bit of backslide happening that we're seeing, or no?
This is a great question. And so if I'm not sure how well the audio is on everyone's end on Zoom, so I want to repeat what Rebecca said. She asked, she has noticed, and I think that we all probably have noticed this kind of, sort of what she just termed turf backslide, turf, right, trans exclusionary radical feminism or feminists. Yeah, I mean, I think that that's probably an interpretation question that maybe I can toss to Anthony too. From a bioarch perspective, I'm kind of seeing the opposite, where bioarchaeologists are sort of being oh wait, maybe we should be thinking about these topics and considering them, and can we answer questions about gender expression and performance in the past? So I'm from the past perspective, I think that we're seeing a bigger light shown on gender kind of variance from like a modern cultural standpoint, I don't know. There is a lot of that really concerning turf kind of stuff out there. I think that, sorry that your favorite author, J.K. Rowling, is a massive turf. So Anthony, if you want to kind of, I don't know if you consider that in your talk at all, but we definitely want to hear your perspective too. So I'm going to flip over. I have a lot of slides that we can get back to if we want to talk about like ARC specific things. But I'm going to stop sharing my slides now and ask Anthony to go ahead and share his.
Hi, yeah, I actually did, while I was building my slideshow, I did come across a number of things that fall right in line with that question, actually, and I will make sure that I touch on them as we go along. Give me just a moment to get my slides up.
So I'll say on my end too, Anthony, I'll try to monitor, like if anybody has questions, Anthony loves to be interrupted and ask the questions.
Yeah, that's fine. I actually,
So,
I have time for questions at the end, but if anybody has a question that they want to interrupt me and ask, that's actually easier for me to do than waiting till the end, because I'd rather you ask it while the information's fresh. I'm going to share my screen and hope that it works. Hold on. Which tab is it? Oh no, it's this one. I hope I'm doing this right. Yes, allow Zoom to share your screen. That's what I want. There you go. I don't know if that worked. Hold on. This one, share. Okay, here's my slides. And if I make this full screen, will you still be able to see it present? All right, is that showing up for everybody?
Yep, we can see it here in class.
Great. Okay, so hi. As Dr. Amy just introduced me, I'm Anthony Redgrave. I am the co-founder of the Trans Doe Task Force and Redgrave Research Forensic Services, and also Forensic Genealogy Training for Law Enforcement. I wrote myself some notes that I can't see while I'm in full screen, so hold on. I'll just ramble about myself while I pull up my notes. I am a doctoral student at University of New England right now, studying for my educational doctorate in transformative leadership in education, which is usually the career path that people take for being a principal or head of school, but I am building my own school for forensic genealogy, because there's really only a handful of people in the world who are good enough at that to make it be their career, and there needs to be more, because there's no shortage of cold cases to work on. And where, no, I've got it on my phone now, I think. Here it is. Okay, now I can see my notes on my phone while I'm talking to you. And yeah, you need to bring the other computer. My dual screen is not working today, so I can't use the notes separate.
I think if he wanted to like just share like the window, then he could have like the slides on the window be like half the screen, and then have like the notes on like another window that's not shared.
I think I'm good. I think I'm good now. But thank you. That would have been good to think of earlier. But I'm all
so good at Zoom.
Okay, so you already covered all this. So I'm originally from Baltimore, Maryland, and I live with my spouse and my teenager here in Massachusetts, where it is significantly safer but also colder. I am transgender and intersex, and I use he, him pronouns, and I am the co-founder of the Trans Doe Task Force. The Trans Doe Task Force is this. You probably heard of us all before, but if you haven't, we're a small group of, it's a grassroots effort to research cold cases in which an unidentified decedent may have been transgender or gender variant. We also advise and educate public, media, and law enforcement regarding the needs of and sensitive differences between trans Doe cases and other Doe cases. So, you know, largely focused around language that's used in when media is released, or interviewing family members, or how to communicate this information to other departments. We help people who aren't familiar with that navigate that, as well as being a trans-informed group of forensic genealogists who can handle cases in which a decedent may show gender variance that you can't identify from skeletal remains and you can only learn from the lived identity. So Amy has probably told you all about us.
Yes, I have.
So just to get started, here's some standard definitions that we're going to use for this presentation, just based solely on the fact that there's a lot of arguing about language that goes on all the time, because language is used for self-identification and also evolves over time. So for the sake of this talk, we're using these terms for consistency. So sex is male, female, or intersex division of a species, especially as differentiated with reference to the reproductive functions. Gender is either the male or female division of a species, especially as differentiated by social and cultural roles and behavior, or the classification that is outside the male-female binary that is based on an individual's personal awareness or identity. So basically, sex is largely biological, gender is largely social. Transgender is noting or relating to a person whose gender identity does not correspond to that person's sex assigned at birth. That term has been hotly debated for a number of reasons. It was originally referred to as transsexual, indicating a person who transitions from one sex to another, which in some ways is more technically accurate, but is often used in a derogatory manner, so we don't use it very much anymore. Intersex is related to a person, animal, or plant having male and female reproductive organs, or in which the chromosomal patterns do not fall under typical definitions of male and female. We're going to be talking a lot about intersex conditions today, because that is part that is not as well understood as transgender issues are presently, so I've got quite a bit of information covering that. So, the reality of it all is that sex is not binary. There are a number of factors and variables that contribute to a person's sex, including chromosomes, genes, hormones, hormone receptors, internal sex organs, external sex organs, and secondary sex characteristics. All of these things combined, it's kind of a wonder that anyone could think that there's only two sexes, because there's actually at least 47 variations of intersex conditions along the binary sex spectrum that do not fall cleanly into the male or female box. And some of these are visible and some of them are invisible. Some people go around their entire life not even knowing that they have an intersex presentation anywhere in their entire body or in their chromosomes, and they're fine with that. And they carry on normal lives, have children, have families, and everything's fine. But it's sometimes it's visible, and that's when people notice, and that's mostly what we're going to be talking about here, because that's the data that we have.
Oh, we have a question already, Anthony.
Ooh, a question. I love questions. What's the
From
question?
Emily.
So in regards to like people who are intersex or intersex individuals or even transgender, would the hormones or like the increase of estrogen or testosterone or the decrease affect the skeleton makeup before or after like puberty, if that makes sense?
That is a very good question. There's actually not a whole lot of data on that specifically, and that's something that the Trans Doe Task Force would like to maybe assist in, or maybe let people know that it's fuzzy and we can't entirely pin that down. There is some data on the effects of hormone replacement therapy in transgender individuals, but not a whole lot, because most people I can't speak for most people, but the majority of people that I can think of are not necessarily going to submit to medical study to actually study that. So we don't have that data. So that is the long way of saying I don't have a good answer for you.
Did you see Catherine has a question in the chat too?
Oh, I didn't see the chat. What's the question from the chat?
It is,
Go
go ahead, Catherine.
Okay, what's an example of an I guess like an intersex variation that we can't see?
An example of an intersex variation that you can't see is definitely a chromosomal variation. There are a number of different sex chromosome variations, the 23rd chromosome, that can vary in an individual who has perfectly, like, cleanly fitting into one box or the other internal and external sex organs and secondary sex characteristics. And these are things like, there's a number of them, like the more well-known ones are things like Klinefelter syndrome is something that people who are assigned male might have an extra Y. They might be XYY and have an extra Y chromosome in addition to their X and Y, and it can have some other health effects that you might see, but you might not necessarily equate that to being related to your sex chromosomes. There's a number of other ones. Yeah, and a lot of people don't even think that Klinefelter's is an intersex condition because it doesn't present physically in that way. There's other ones that are less obvious that are, there's things called mosaicism, which is when some of your cells inside of your body have one presentation of chromosomes and the others have others, and that means that depending on when and where you test, you might get different results. There's a whole bunch of things like that that aren't very well understood, and if you go to isna.org, there's a FAQ that has a rundown of some of the different conditions and how they present or don't present. You can read up on that. I don't have a link to that in my presentation, but I'll make sure that y'all get it.
I think these stats here on the bottom of the slide are like very compelling. I mean, think about this, students in my class, in terms of bioarch and also forensics. A lot of you taking forensic anthropology. Look at that. I mean, surgery to normalize, quote unquote, 1 or 2 in 1,000 births, that's a lot of people that we're talking about.
It really is.
All right. Yeah, Rebecca, do you have a question? Another question, Anthony?
I was just wondering, like, I don't know like a huge amount about like genes or chromosomes or stuff like that, and I forget if like they like show up well like in skeletal records. Like, is that something that like you can test for with like unknown remains? Like, can you test like for some of these invisible intercepts, like hormonal or chromosomal like differences, like just from like the skeleton, if there's like confusion about like sex?
So from unknown remains, Anthony, can you get any of this information in the DNA sequencing process?
Well, if a sex estimation is inconclusive or not entirely certain, and if people are following standard procedures and they're going to take a DNA sample to put into the CODIS system for unidentified remains, then that will come along with looking at the 23rd chromosome karyotype, but they don't necessarily look at that in terms of trying to find differences or know what to do if there is one. It's unusual enough that I've never heard of a standard STR CODIS test coming up with information that remains are actually intersex. They're usually, when you get the DNA back from unidentified skeletal remains, they just check one box or the other. They're not looking for that. And that's a problem that's endemic to the system, is that there's not room for write-in, basically. So I can't tell you if anyone's ever found that because there's not a checkbox for it in the system.
Thank you.
I'm gonna move on unless there's another question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. All right, so here's more about statistics. As Amy was saying, these statistics are very compelling. If you look at it this way, you can see that there are studies that show that the number of the average percentage of the human population that is in some way intersex is somewhere between 1% and 2%. And it's the same projected amount as the number of people in the population who are redheads. Now, the odds are pretty good that if you've ever met a redhead, you probably also met an intersex person, and you probably didn't even know it. And they might not have either. Now, here's a problem with statistics. This is actually from the website I was just talking about, the ISNA website. So, how common is intersex? To answer this question in an uncontroversial way, you'd have to first get everyone to agree on what counts as intersex, and also to agree on what should count as strictly male and strictly female. As we talked about earlier with the issue of Klinefelter syndrome, there are some people who think that that's not necessarily an intersex condition because it doesn't present physically as one, but it is a chromosomal difference on the 23rd chromosome. Now, I would classify that as an intersex condition, but there are people who would argue with me about that. And likewise, if you want to talk about redheads, like how red are we talking here? I mean, do strawberry blondes count, or are we only talking about gingers? I mean, I don't know what the statistics are on that. So my good friend, Kate Bornstein, in her lovely book, My Gender Workbook, which you should look up if you've never seen it before, says very simply, gender is indisputably something.
I love that quote.
She's amazing. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we're going to go about defining something. And as you already know from Dr. Amy, that the context colors how you're going to categorize something. So we're going to look at some examples throughout different cultures and different religions that might affect whether or not you would consider someone to be transgender or intersex based on the society in which they lived. So here we have two fine examples of men's fashion in France. So what do you all think? Are these both really manly men? They're pretty manly. They're the epitomes of manhood, right?
I personally love that heel.
Isn't it great?
Yes.
So these are actually both pinnacles of masculinity, but if you're viewing these examples from the perspective of someone in the 20th century, you might not think so, but let's get some context. High-heeled shoes were first worn in the 10th century as a way to help the Persian cavalry keep their shoes in their stirrups for their horses. So high-heeled shoes were once considered a masculine gendered clothing because the item served a purpose. In serving a function, keeping shoes in the stirrups while you're on a horse, they also indicate a societal position. So a wealthy man would have high heels in order to be able to ride his horse, which he could also afford. A poor man would be less likely to have high heels, as they would have been impractical since he would not have a horse. Therefore, form and functionality work synergistically in this example to equate high heels with a wealthy male identity. Here's one of my favorite ones to talk about, translation issues in the King James Version of the Bible. Now, the King James Version of the Bible is widely accepted to be the standard English translation from the many languages that the original texts were in. So we're going to look at a very multi-layered use or misuse of context and language. And in the terms of the word servant here, which I've circled, in the King James translation, there's one word, servant, but it's used in place of at least two words. This is one example. In this case, the word doulos is used to describe someone who's born into slavery. This is one example of one of several stories in which Jesus heals someone's servant, and that's pretty standard. We know a lot of those stories are in there, right? So let's take a look at this one. In Matthew 8, 5-7, we have Jesus being approached by a Roman centurion saying, Lord, my servant lieth at home sick of the palsy, grievously tormented, and Jesus saith unto him, I will come and heal him. Now, that's very nice of him. He's going to heal a servant. A servant's a servant, right? Well, this is a different kind of servant. So, in the original Greek, this is a completely different word, pious, which has more than one meaning depending on how you use it. In this case, since we're talking about a Roman centurion, he's not going to have a child. So what he probably has is a same-sex partner that he had to purchase, because that's what you would have had to do at the time. So we can suppose that this servant is a different kind of servant than the other one, and that's okay because Jesus healed him anyway. Hold on. And furthermore, the use of the word eunuch. Now, typically nowadays, when someone says the word eunuch, you think that you're talking about a castrated male, because that's the standard definition that most people in European society think of. But it's actually used in a number of places in the King James Version of the Bible and in academic texts as a catch-all term for anyone gender variant. So in this instance, we can see that in Jesus's words, he's giving us a number of possible definitions of the word eunuch, including, for there are some eunuchs which were so born from their mother's womb, which could very easily imply or include intersex people. Moving on to a completely different society. So Old Norse society had a code of conduct that dictated you could actually kill someone if they called you effeminate or unmasculine, or implied that you broke oaths that you made with other people or had sex with animals. So if somebody said a mean thing about you in Old Norse society, you could actually kill them. Most of the terms that fell under this law had to do with taking an effeminate or passive position in same-sex male sex. This is pretty interesting if you consider the pop culture definition of a Viking. You think big, burly, super masculine guy. You might be like, okay, that makes sense. But there are a number of examples in Old Norse stories and beliefs where there's a lot of gender play going on. For example, there's that time when Loki turned into a female horse and gave birth to another horse. Or that time that Thor disguised himself as a woman at a wedding party and all the guests were like, wow, that lady, she sure eats a lot, right? And here's an especially compelling one in which there is a story where Odin goes to Freya to learn a highly starkly gendered women's magic called Satyr. She says, yeah, I'll teach you this magic, but you've got to wear skirts for a year. So that just goes to show you that if even the Allfather thinks that it's worth getting called ergi or arger or any of those not very nice words that people in Norse culture decided were so bad that you could kill somebody for calling you that, it must have been really, really worth it to learn this highly specific women's magic. He was willing to take that. So, interesting.
So was it like a duel or like straight up murder? Like,
oh, you could just kill people.
okay.
It might be a duel if they tried to fight back, but for the most part, if someone said something like that, you could just kill them. And if you went before your earl or your jarl of your village and explained your situation, he'd be like, yeah, you were justified in doing that. You're fine.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So there's an archaeological gravesite in Sweden that was originally excavated in 1889. Originally, it was just called the Birka Viking grave because it was in Birka, Sweden. So the grave goods included horses, weapons, games, other things commonly associated with a warrior's burial. And it was originally assumed to be male because, you know, these grave goods are traditionally male things that we've seen in other male warrior grave sites. So why would we have any reason to question that? And there's also, you know, known observer bias at the time that if they found a skeleton of indeterminate sex, they would say, oh, this is a guy. And so there was no reason to doubt that. In 2017, the remains went under anthropological analysis and were determined to be female. Well, that should have been very interesting on its own, but what went further from there is that a number of people decided to argue about that and say, oh, those things weren't hers. This was symbolic. No, it wasn't. You also can't necessarily suppose that this female warrior was a transgender man because there is a very two-sided perception of what's okay for gender roles in Norse society, where it's considered not okay for men to take on a female role, but it's perfectly okay for women to take quite a bit of men's occupations and roles on. So all evidence suggests that these were her belongings and she was buried with things that she used in her everyday life.
I love that you included this example, Anthony, and I will, as a bioarchaeologist, butt in to say my blood pressure raises when I see this, you know, these interpretations. And also that this is not a standalone. There's a great Viking, like phenomenally interesting Viking burial where an older woman was buried, an entire ship was buried, right? Like huge pomp and circumstance around her burial, probably had, you know, a kind of like an afterlife servant that was sacrificed at the time along with her. But for so long it was like, oh, well, it's such a kind of decorated burial. I mean, they buried a whole ship. This has to be a male, right? But she's not. And just this idea, I mean, look at this kind of this is what, you know, I'm lecturing my bioarch students now, but, you know, this is the kind of like internalized sort of misogyny that you have to fight against when you're writing, because, you know, this should not be surprised. It should not be like shocking to people that you know, they have to go through all these kind of mental justifications to say like, oh, well, if she was a female, then she wasn't this, or maybe she was transgender, or maybe, you know, I mean, sometimes you just can, you need to step outside of your own kind of internalized misogyny in Western culture to see that the Vikings did it differently, and so did a lot of other people. So, sorry, I couldn't help myself.
Oh, it's okay. I could go on about that for hours if you want to, but let's do it when we're not in class.
Yeah, we'll do it later tonight.
All right. So just to go over these really quick, there's a number of other societies throughout history where gender variance is an indicator of very powerful magic or spirituality. In India, there's the Hijra, who are both looked down upon and also considered divine at the same time. I discovered in the process of making this presentation that there's apparently an Italian group of they're classified as effeminate men, but they're basically a third gender, who are somehow considered lucky or good luck somehow. And this is something I'm going to have to read more up about because I didn't know anything about it. And they're separate from homosexual societies somehow. They're actually like a different society. And there's so many different presentations that I'm even still learning things. So that's pretty interesting. So now that we've gone over a little bit of context, we're going to talk about some specific examples throughout history. And some of these you probably never heard of or may have not considered as being examples of trans or intersex people. So the first one, we're going to go in chronological order here. First one is a Greek academic skeptic philosopher named Favorinus, who, interestingly enough, academic skepticism is the theory that it's basically impossible to know anything. So that goes well here when we're talking about deconstructing gender. I thought that was fun to throw in there. He is described as being a eunuch by birth, born without testicles, having a high voice and no beard. So if we go back to where we were learning about the use of the word eunuch in the King James Bible, again, with the use of eunuchs to describe intersex people. Scholars believe he may have had androgen insensitivity syndrome, which is a particular kind of hormone receptor-based intersex condition that can actually result in a number of different presentations, more than I'm able to list right now. So I'm gonna trust this academic scholar on this, but he had only a few fragmentary works remained from his body of work, but plenty of stuff about people talking about him and what he was like. So that's what we've got to go on for him. The Chevalier d'Eon is fascinating. During the French Revolution era, before the Revolution, Chevalier d'Eon was a spy, a diplomat, a dragoon, a highly regarded military person who infiltrated the Russian court dressed as a woman at some point around 1760. And there were actually rumors that d'Eon was actually a woman. Probably because they were so good at presenting as such. I personally believe that what happened here was that they probably knew that they were having a transgender experience in different terms at the time, because that term wasn't coined until later. And so in 1777, d'Eon went to the French court and claimed to have been assigned female at birth, but raised as a boy to ensure an inheritance. Now keep in mind that this is somebody who's very charismatic, who is a spy and really good at getting people to do what he wants them to do. And d'Eon goes to the court and says, hey, this is the truth. So Louis XIV allows this person to socially transition to female and gives them a stipend to purchase a wardrobe of women's clothes. That's awesome. Upon d'Eon's death in 1810, physicians that examined their body declared that she had male organs in every respect perfectly formed, but also feminine characteristics. So there's some likelihood that there was some kind of intersex condition going on here. But at the very least, we can say d'Eon would, by today's standards, be considered an early example of a transgender person.
Wow.
And that's supposition, because we don't know entirely how that was handled during that period of time, because this is the only example that we have of this. Here's my favorite cousin. This is my 7th cousin, a few times removed. That's how I found out who this is. 5th cousin. Oh, it's my 5th cousin. So this is the Public Universal Friend. This is the first founder of a spiritual movement who was American-born and also is non-binary. The Public Universal Friend was assigned female at birth, and as a teenager was bedridden with a fever, probably typhoid, for a couple of days and was near death. When they awoke from their fever, they declared that their soul had ascended to heaven and that a genderless spirit had been sent from God to inhabit them and preach to the people. And they started to refer them to themselves as the Public Universal Friend. Now, the Friends family were Quakers, so this was not an unusual concept. This was very similar to Quaker beliefs at the time. They adopted androgynous clothing, wearing elements of both traditional male and female clothing at the same time, refused to answer to their former name or gendered pronouns. They started a religious movement that lasted until about 1860 and then died out, but there's still a lot of publications you can read about it. And it's actually very interesting. But they were actually fairly well accepted for the most part amongst Quakers, which is fascinating to me. But you'll see that there are examples of people who are clearly non-binary making a pretty decent way for themselves and a pretty decent impact in society and being visible.
Hey, Anthony?
Yes?
Is there anything in the historical literature about the pronouns that this person preferred or answered to? I mean, this is I've never heard of this. This is like blowing my mind right now.
Okay, well, from what I've read so far, the friend was usually just referred to as the friend, or in the case of not being able to avoid pronouns, used male pronouns.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, okay, we have another question.
Okay, yeah.
Would they be considered would their soul be considered an angel? Because technically angels don't have, in the Bible, angels don't have a gender. They're just kind of like God's love and grace. So would their soul be replaced by like a agendered angel?
I think that was the general vibe that was being expressed, but the words were different because of the difference in Quaker beliefs. Like they were described as a spirit sent from the heavens, which you could definitely call an angel by most respects.
And do you know where like geographically this is happening? Is this in the Northeast? I just want to look up more. I can Google.
Was the friend in Connecticut or Rhode Island? Rhode Island. Yeah.
Really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we should take a trip and go visit their gravesite.
100% I'm in.
Totally. Oh, right. Their gravesite isn't known, but I think there's a memorial somewhere that the Historical Society has a lot of their clothing, actually, and some of their books.
Wow.
New York. It's in New York. Yeah, they went from Rhode Island to New York, so there's a Historical Society in New York that has a lot of their belongings.
Oh my gosh. Let's go.
Let's go. So I'm going to try to get through a couple of these pretty quick because I think I'm rambling a lot here. Here's one of my favorites. Albert Cashier was assigned female at birth and enlisted in the Union Army under the name Albert Cashier, served for the entire duration of the war, and was honorably discharged when they were mustered out as an entire unit. But unlike other assigned female people at the time who went to war as a man, they continued to live as a man and received a soldier's pension for the course of his entire life. He was injured in a car accident in 1911 and was rendered unable to work, so had to be hospitalized at the soldier's home. The physician who treated his broken leg discovered his secret, but actually did not disclose it, which is, I don't know what the motivation is beyond that, but I love that person very dearly. So he stayed at the soldier's home until 1914, until he started showing signs of elderly dementia and was transferred to an asylum. And we know the history of psychological mental health care, and that obviously didn't go well because the attendants at the asylum discovered Albert's sex and forced him to wear female attire. Even in his deteriorating mental state, he was still known to pin up his skirts to make makeshift pants. His friends who visited him, who were fellow veterans, ensured that he continued to receive his pension payments when he was investigated for actual fraud. They were like, no, he served alongside us and he deserves this. So he's a wonderful example of how you can continue to assert yourself and actually get support sometimes. His gravestone is very interesting because they replaced it at some point. It used to have his dead name on it, and now it has both names on it. It's still not perfect, but it's better than it was. In regards to the question that was asked earlier about the turf activity, I will tell you something very interesting about this, and the next couple of people we're going to talk about is that in the process of doing research on all of these historical figures, I have run into a number of people who definitely fall under the turf umbrella of radical feminism, who are trying to claim these obviously transgender men as feminist heroes. And it happens over and over again. And this happens with Albert here. It happens with the next one, Alan Hart.
Question about that real quick, Anthony.
Yes.
So, like, did Albert's dead name, like, they were legally born with it, but were they known throughout life as that name, or like, were they just always known as Albert? It's like, if they were only known as Albert, then they should have Albert on their gravestone and not their dead name, because that just seems pretty, not only disrespectful, but like also like really weird, because like, be like a nickname on a gravestone, like, why would you have that?
It's I don't know the particulars of how the dead name ended up on the original stone exactly, except for to say that when Albert returned from war, he settled in an area where nobody else knew him and worked under an exclusively male identity and never spoke of it. And most people didn't know, except for some people that he actually lived with for a time. He was a farmhand with a family, and they knew, and they didn't out him either. So there must have been some kind of paper trail where at some point, probably during asylum care, they found out. And that's my best guess there. So I hope that answered that.
That's like a powerful example of how, you know, the people that Albert associated with seem to be completely accepting and not outing him at all. But, you know, once he gets into the medical system, they're medicalizing their response to his gender. Yeah, that's
yes,
an interesting and sad one.
Yeah, the medicalization of the trans and intersex experience is a major problem that actually is something that colors our personal view now of trans experiences in the past. So that is definitely something cultural to think about. We have thoroughly medicalized it because we have the ability to do that for both good and ill. But it does affect the way we look at things. This is a prime example of medical intervention that went well. Alan Hart is, to my knowledge, the earliest example of what I would consider a transgender man who successfully medically transitioned. His birth father died when he was about 5 years old, and he was in the care of his grandparents for most of his young life. And his grandfather let him run around and present his mail and like do boy stuff, and didn't hold him back or anything. And when his mother remarried and they moved, he had to go to a regular school, not live on the farm anymore, and present as female. Even the teachers at that school allowed him to use a male name at the time. And when he eventually moved on to medical school, he was issued his doctorate under his dead name because that's just what the school records were under. And that limited his ability to seek employment, but he still continued to persevere and find outlets to actually get the appropriate medical care. Since he went to medical school, he had connections where he could actually get hysterectomy in the winter break in between semesters and recover from it. So between 1917 and 1918, he was the earliest transgender man to undergo a gender confirmation surgery in the form of a hysterectomy. After that, he legally changed his name and gender and married a woman. He also was one of the first people to receive gender confirmation hormone therapy, because as soon as it was available in 1920, being that he was already in the medical field, he had immediate access to it. He devoted his entire medical career, however, to tuberculosis research. That was the thing that drove him, and also specifically correcting misdiagnoses of other ailments that were often misdiagnosed upon people who actually had tuberculosis and didn't get proper care fast enough. Upon his death, he requested that all of his personal communications and photographs be destroyed. So he's interesting in that he's what people of my generation would call stealth. He was very devoted to keeping his former lived identity as a female person completely under wraps, to the point where he had to constantly correct his former classmates who kept accidentally outing him because they didn't know what to do about it. It was new to them. So he's been all but almost entirely forgotten by society now, and he's probably glad for that, because this is not the kind of attention that he would want. So we're not going to spend any more time on him.
Oh, but we have a question.
Okay.
And in your research and your kind of findings, do you see a difference between kind of rural people who are rural or worked in the agricultural field being more accepting of kind of the fluidity of gender and fluidity of kind of presenting as such than in kind of urban cities, what industrialized cities?
There's problems in both circles, I'll say that. and it varies because that ties in with the medicalization and categorization of things, because when you get into urban areas, things are a little bit more tighter run and more regimented just because of things being categorized and strict and grid-like as the city is even. And so that's one thing to consider, is that it's harder to get your medical care and paperwork taken care of when everybody's all up in your business like that. If you're living in a rural area, it might be easier to just fly under the radar and get people to leave you alone, but there's the possibility that someone might not want to leave you alone, and then there's nothing anybody can do about it because there's nobody else around. So it's, and you also don't have access to resources as well. Next one here. So this is Christine Jorgensen. I'm putting her in here because a lot of people already know about her, but it's important to include her because it's very easy to forget how long ago she was visible and present. Her medical transition was in 1952, and honestly, people were fascinated by her. There was people who were upset, because there's always people who are upset, but she actually was so charismatic and well-spoken and witty and outspoken, really, and direct, that she used her celebrity to be an advocate for transgender people. She went on to be an actress and a singer and an entertainer, and she eventually just died living a quiet life, and I honestly don't know what happened to her at the end, but she was also one of the first trans women to receive hormone replacement therapy. She was definitely not the first to have gender confirmation surgery, although the news articles that ran about her indicated that she was, because they didn't do their research. She was probably the first American, but definitely not the first person ever, and we'll get into that in just a minute. So media visibility. So we've talked about a bunch of real life historic examples of transgender people who really lived and really had really exciting lives. Now we're going to talk about some examples in popular culture and media that have occurred over time that you can, nowadays you can see a lot of bad examples, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But the main thing I want to talk about there is that up until fairly recently, it was not uncommon for trans people in media to be portrayed as either perpetrators or victims of crime, or deviant in some way, or sneaky, or prostitutes, or criminals, or dead. And that's unfortunately the truth for the most part. But I'm going to show you some fairly good examples now, because this is what we're doing. Where'd I put my mouse? Here it is. My desk is a little bit of a mess right now. I'm clicking you, go to the next one. There we go. All right, so we're going to start with Mulan. Everybody knows the story of Mulan because Disney, and everybody knows that the story is based on a very old Chinese story. However, what you don't know is that the story has gone through several different revisions that are all relevant to the times in which they were written. Originally, it was just an oral story that was passed down, and the idea was that she was just getting her job done because her father didn't have any adult sons, so she went to war. And there's some indication that at that time that would have been considered admirable of her and not shameful, that she was actually honoring her family by doing that and supporting the patriarchy in doing that. But there's not a whole lot of contextual clues to really infer that, but that is a possibility. There's a later adaptation of her story in 1695, where this is the one that people usually reference when they're going, oh, the Disney version ended on a happier note than the original version. This is not the original version. This is like a far down the road adaptation, where there's a novel in which there's a very heavy focus on self-identification and autonomy, where Mulan commits suicide at the end of the story in order to avoid being raped and to maintain her personal identity and her right to autonomy.
a later version in 1939 has a more military bent on it because it was created during the time when China was occupied by the Japanese. So it was more patriotic and militaristic and less focused on her. And she was just regarded as a hero for that story. And then when you get back around in the circle to the 1998 version of the Disney film, we get back into the concept of self-identification and specifically binary gender equity. At the end of the movie, she's back home, she's back wearing her pretty dress, but she's got like a little bit of spice to her, you know? She's like, girls can do anything raw. But that wasn't always the point of the story. The point of the story has actually changed frequently. Here's one of my personal favorites. This is the first example of a positive transgender character that I personally ever saw on TV.
Me too. I love that you included her.
Well, of course I would.
Of course.
So the TV show Twin Peaks, which if you haven't seen it, please do, but be careful, go with trepidation, is a fantastic series. Basically is a murder mystery, but then it gets real weird. And David Duchovny, who later went on to play FBI agent Mulder, played an FBI agent named Denise Bryson, who was a trans woman who transitioned on the job. Much like we learned about the Chevalier Dayon, Denise went undercover in female clothing and found that she felt more comfortable, and that's the premise for her transitioning on the job. And then in the later season that they released in 2017, she's actually promoted to the FBI Chief of Staff and is actually highly supported by most of her coworkers at that time. And maybe that's a little bit not realistic, but I really appreciate it. And in my opinion, and from my further research, I'm pretty sure this is the earliest positive portrayal of a trans woman as a reoccurring character on a television show, and nobody noticed.
That's a really good point, actually, Anthony. And if anyone has watched Twin Peaks, you'll probably know why nobody noticed. There's so much weird stuff going on. It's like, David Duchovny playing a woman is like nothing.
Yeah, that's like the least of your concerns.
Yeah, it's like that. That's totally normal.
But she's not a perpetrator or a victim, so people don't care.
Right.
Yeah. She's like, oh, there's just this lady here. Here's what I promised Amy I would put in here to cover the time and space. So in the Alien series, in the first movie, there's a character named Joan Lambert. So when you first watch the films, you think this is just another member of the crew. She's nervous, she's anxious, but she's still like the last female character standing at the end and the last one to die before Ripley is the only living survivor of the Nostromo. And that's all well and good. And at that point in time, you're like, oh, great, look at that. They actually had one of the female characters make it to the end too. That's really progressive for a scary movie. Well, actually, in the 1986 sequel, there's some stuff going on in the background at the beginning opening scene where they're giving Ripley her briefing that is basically expository for the previous movie for people who didn't see it. And there's some dossiers of the deceased crew members that are scrolling through the screens in the background. And Jones has a very interesting little thing in it that we're going to take a minute to discuss real quick here. So, what do we see here? It says, subject is a Despin convert at birth, male to female. So, anybody want to just volunteer? What's your first impression of this statement about this character, Joan? What do you think this actually means about her?
You're trans and or non-binary.
Or they're intersex and they got surgery when they were born.
Either of those would be possible. The language is pretty vague. Like that might be us reading it through our context. So what other explanations could there be for this description other than your first impression, considering that the film takes place in 2122 and not 2020? So what could have happened from now to then in the future that, I mean, what is it? What is a Despin convert? I mean, what does this mean? At birth, what does this mean? Any other ideas?
Maybe they're an alien or some kind of genetic hybrid with an alien. or alien mutation?
Either of those would be good too, yeah. So, you know, this is an interesting thing to think about in terms of like the meaning of despot convert at birth isn't explained anywhere else in the alien universe in any of the canon stories. I looked, trust me, I tried real hard, and there's no explanation for this. So how does this compare to our lack of context for seeming gender variance in earlier civilizations where we don't have context for something that we're seeing? Like, what do we have to admit that we don't know, and how do we deal with that?
This is like the most beautiful example I've ever heard in my life, Anthony.
Well,
This
thank
is
you.
blowing my mind, because what Anthony's asking you to do is what I've been asking you to do in class, right? Use your 2020 framework to look back in the past to these archaeological samples. Anthony's asking you to go into the future and look back at us today and how we would interpret it. This is like so cool. I don't have the words.
Well, thank you. You know, I have my own theories about it. I'm like, well, what my brain went, is a despot convert like a kind of religious sect? Is it the name of a doctor who developed some kind of procedure? Like, there's a number of theories, and there's no explanation. Ridley Scott's got tight lips about it, driving me crazy. Really wish he'd tell me, but it's kind of fun to use as an example here. So we've talked about some fun stuff. Now we're going to talk about some stuff that's a little harder to talk about, but then we'll get back to happy stuff again, so it'll be okay. So how are we made invisible? So we've seen a bunch of examples of visibility in real life and in media and things that look like they had some pretty positive outcomes for the most part, but there's plenty of factors working to erase the existence of non-binary individuals. So let's talk about those for a minute. This is the hardest one right here, culturally accepted intersex infanticide. There are a number of cultures in the world who still practice just killing children as soon as they're born if they have ambiguous genitalia. This is very prevalent in South and East Africa, South Asia, Brazil, and China. In specifically Africa, an intersex child is considered to be a bad omen, and home birth attendants will just kill the infant and tell the mother that they were stillborn and never talk about it again. This is one of the reasons why we don't have good numbers on the number of intersex individuals, because these are just not talked about. They're done in secret and they're just gotten rid of. This one is something that is not a very known topic. We all know that World War II and the Holocaust was a terrible time, and a number of terrible things were done that were backwards in progress. There was a German sexologist named Magnus Hirschfeld, who was a very outspoken homosexual man from Poland who had a large sex research institute in Germany, who was one of the first people to actually perform sex reassignment surgeries or gender confirmation surgeries, and was doing research on how to get appropriate medical care for people who are homosexual, who are being turned away from other places. He noticed that there was a high level of suicide for people in the LGBT community, and he was willing to face that and deal with it. He was attacked and brutally injured and exiled from Germany and died. I don't even know exactly where he ended up. I think he ended up in Switzerland. But his entire body of work was destroyed by the Nazis. They took all of his things out of his private research institute, burned them, and all of that is just lost forever. And he was a huge pioneer. It set us back decades, possibly more. You can learn a lot more about him. I'll provide this this PowerPoint to everyone if you want to look at it. This is the link to what's remaining of his institute online. There's a group that's tried to preserve as much as they can. It's mostly in German, but you can Google translate it. So this is possibly the hardest one for me to talk about personally because it's hitting close to home. There's fairly well known at this at this point, a case called the Joan case. They were twin brothers born in 1965, and one of them, Bruce, had his genitals irreversibly damaged during an infant circumcision. So he was given surgical and hormonal intervention and was raised as a girl named Brenda. The doctor responsible for this routinely lied about the success of this treatment at every evaluation, and also had the twins simulate sexual acts with each other to stimulate supposedly healthy development of sexual identity. This man had some very crazy ideas of what sex identity actually meant. Brian, the twin who was not given surgical intervention, developed schizophrenia and actually overdosed on his schizophrenia medication because it was just too much for him to deal with. And at age 13, Brenda was told the truth by her parents and transitioned socially and medically and took the name David. And he tried to live a relatively normal life, but in 2006 he also committed suicide. So both brothers involved in this just took their own lives because of the trauma that occurred from this really irresponsible medical experiment on real live humans. This is the man responsible. This is Dr. John Money. He was a clinical sexologist specializing in sexual identity and biology of gender. On one hand, that might sound like a really useful thing to specialize in, but what he did was very harmful. He had the belief that gender was learned rather than innate. So he believed that because he could medically intervene on this boy, he could make a girl. He really thought he could do that. He fabricated findings from this study as a basis for infant surgical interventions for children with ambiguous or abnormal genitalia, as he called it. And there's plenty of clear evidence that his research was fabricated and that his practices are damaging, but it's still the basis that many doctors use to adhere to his methodologies and practices and continue with infant medical intervention for people who are born with intersex genitalia. His research is a large part of the basis for a large part of transgender healthcare as it is now, both in positive and negative ways, because on one hand, we have a lot to be afraid of based on his misinformation, but also we can clearly see where he went wrong, and many people have learned from this. So this horror story sounds like it should be ancient history, but it's not. My letter from my clinical sexologist in Baltimore recommending me for hormone therapy very pointedly starts with, "Dear John, when I was seeking trans-related medical health care in 2004, the doctors at Johns Hopkins were still consulting him on patient care. My doctor now has his old job and is doing much better at it, and also trans people don't need to see clinical sexologists anymore." So there's that. So in light of all that, we are actually moving forward. There are a number of countries in the world that are actually starting to outlaw non-consensual medical modifications, including Malta, who was the first to do it in 2015. And their statement on why they chose to do this has actually been used as the basis for other countries who are pioneering efforts to also outlaw infant medical modifications to sexual anatomy. In 2017, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch both published reports on the rights of intersex children. In Colombia, they've chosen a pretty interesting path where parents and doctors of intersex children are restricted from making medical sexual anatomy modifications on children under the age of 5, because they believe that by that time the child may have the opportunity to realize their own gender identity and be able to indicate in some way their own identity, and if that needs to actually be intervened upon for their health. sexual anatomy modifications are now prohibited in Madras, India, except in life-threatening situations. This is a huge deal because we talked about the hijra before. There's a lot of feelings in this area, and to see that they've made that choice is a huge deal. And that's very recent, actually, as of the last year or two. It was 2019 that happened, so that's very good forward progress. This photo that you see on the side here is from a recent rally at I forget where it was held, but they're continuing to. It was in Chicago, yeah. So they actually held an activist movement outside of the Chicago hospital to protest infant medical modifications. So people are doing things, and people are making efforts. There's an Intersex Awareness Day, just like we have National Coming Out Day and Pride Month. We have November 26th is Intersex Awareness Day, and so mark your calendars. Huh? I believe it's November 26th. I can check if I remember correctly. I should have written it down in my PowerPoint.
Question.
Yeah.
So I know that there's like a huge pushback from like, I don't know, the thought that comes to mind is like rural Midwest moms against like letting kids or teens transition like as like transgender. And like, I don't think that that's right, but why, like, I don't feel like there's like as much pushback from like that kind of group on like intersex surgeries on children. Like, why do you kind of think that might be?
Because they don't know that it's happening.
Okay.
Because honestly, there are a number of people who probably had medical intervention as infants that their parents were never told or never fully informed of the reason why it was done. Or the doctors told the parents to never tell the children. Lots of people don't know that this was done to them. I've met several people along the way who have had this experience, who found out later, and they have become staunch advocates for body integrity and autonomy. My records were lost. I may have had something like that happen to me, and I will never know because my records were supposedly destroyed.
That's traumatizing.
Yes, it is. Also, I was wrong. October 26th is Intersex Awareness Day, so I was off by a month. I was going to be late. So, yeah, it's the real reason why people don't push back about that is because they don't actually know what's going on. Hopefully that will change soon. People are getting noisier about it and realizing the damage that can be done by making assumptions for people who can't choose for themselves. You know, there really needs to be a push more in the direction of allowing people to make their own choices. And if something is not life-threatening, then it should, in fact, be left alone.
It seems like maybe, I mean, this is total speculation, Anthony, but, you know, maybe too, these doctors are kind of operating under this like antiquated fear assumption, like, what if someone sees them in the locker room or something? That doesn't even happen. That's not happening anymore. Like, I feel like we've kind of, like, doctors should catch up to the fact that, like, you know, current modern generations of young people are not conceptualizing gender the same way that their 65, 70-year-old doctor is.
To be completely honest, the issue of, at least in the US, of anatomical modifications of intersex infants didn't really become a problem until the 60s when Dr. John Money started meddling in things. It all has to do with penetrative sex. The real issue is that before he made that choice to claim that he'd done something that he hadn't and that it had worked when it had not, the previous assumption was to just make your best guess, check a checkbox, and see how it works out.
Wow. So you really can't trace it all back to him. And
yes, absolutely.
Look at the decades of undoing that work. I mean, like you stated with the person in his current role, that's pretty crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, he definitely instituted the idea that you needed to fix things. So I've already answered some questions, but you can ask me some more questions, like, what is this picture that's on your screen? So this link at the bottom, you should check this lady out. If I don't know what she identifies as, this person makes approachable anatomical models and instructional, like, object-based lessons of a variety of intersex genitalia, and they're an intersex educator, and they model different presentations of anatomy so you can just see what they look like. And if you look at this picture, there's some of these that you might be able to say in your brain, oh, that looks like male, that looks like female, but most of them you're like, wait, what am I looking at? And that's okay. And it's not scary, and it's fun, and they're rainbow colors, and you should definitely check out this person's website. I'm highly impressed by their work. So with that said, if you have any other questions, I'm game for them. I don't know if we have any more time. I think I probably
yeah, you are like an expert, kind of ended expertly. We have like 2 minutes. If anybody on Zoom has questions or in class, please feel free.
And you can email me if you have a longer question or you don't feel like asking it right now. It's my email right on the screen there. Or you can find me on Facebook or ask Amy to hook me up with you, like whichever.
And we'll post this I'll have the anthropology page post it, Anthony, and if Women and Gender Studies wants to post it, and then of course feel free to post it to your socials. But I want to say that I learned more today than I feel like I have in 3 weeks. So this was incredible. Thank you so much for taking the time to do it. It seems like I saw some curious note taking in my classroom. So I think
Awesome.
that everyone here learned a lot. So we appreciate your labor on this. That was like a bunch of really awesome historical examples as well. So thank you for giving us things to think about too.
Oh, no problem. Thank you for giving me an outlet to talk about one of my most favorite things in the world. Even the hard stuff.
And I want to re-acknowledge too, Women in Gender Studies did sponsor Anthony's talk, so thank you to them as well. This is awesome. All right, well, that is the end of our class, so I will stop the recording here too. And Anthony, I'm sure we'll talk soon.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, bye.